All right. Ooh. Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome back to the American Museum of Natural History and the Coleman Hall of the Universe. I'm so excited to be doing this. It's been 2.5 years since we last stood on this stage, so thank you all for braving the beautiful weather today to come and hang out with us. My name is Alonso. I look after public programs here at the museum, and it's my absolute pleasure to not be sitting in my kitchen in front of a computer talking to you today. Turns out I do have legs and trousers. I'm incredibly excited about tonight, not only because this is the first in-person SciCafe of what is our 14th season of SciCafe. So we're incredibly excited about having you all back here. By show of hands, who has been to a SciCafe before, in person or online? Amazing. Welcome back. And who's here for the first time? Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is home. Please come back. All right, a couple of things before we get started. What you'll want to do is, if you need a drink, as I do, there's a little bit of a line there that you can get tickets and then go to the bar and get yourself sorted. The other thing is, like, you want to go and look for one of these little cards that are called the Frequent Geek SciCafe cards. The reason you would want it is because every time you come to SciCafe, you will get a stamp. For 3 stamps, you will get a free drink. And at the 5th stamp, we will give you the very coveted and very lovely SciCafe annual t-shirt that I see some people already sporting. So yeah. So it's very excited to have those back. Get ready with your eBay accounts. And then, without further ado, I want to introduce our co-hosts for tonight, which is the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation here at the museum. We're presenting the SciCafe in collaboration with them. And here to introduce our speaker is their director. Please give a hand to Dr. Anna Porzekanski.
Thank you, Alonso. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to be here. Wonderful to see you all here and be gathering again in New York City. New York City is part of Lenape-Hoking, the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. So I want to begin by acknowledging Lenape people's past, present, and future. As Alonso said, I direct the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. And we were created almost 30 years ago to address what I think is the largest challenge of our times, which is sustaining life on Earth for the future. And we do that through a combination of creating connections between people and knowledge, and leading research that connects different strands of knowledge, and also creating the capacity all around the world to lead conservation. And what we are pursuing really in our work is to reach actions and solutions that are robust and equitable and last for a long time. So that's what we're trying to do. You can check out more of our work online at cbc.amnh.org. I also want to mention that tonight's event is part of the Mack, Lipkin, Man and Nature series, a series of events where we explore the interconnections between humans and nature. The series is named for the late Mack Lipkin Sr., a physician whose human and caring approach to the practice of medicine were an enormous inspiration to a whole generation of medical students and physicians. We're also hosting this week, the center is hosting the 13th Student Conference on Conservation Science, New York, which is a really wonderful event. And so some of them are here watching, and they are emerging researchers and leaders in the field of conservation who have convened to exchange their work on science, policy, and practice. And so raise your hand if you're part of the SCCS, just so people can see look at that. That's the future of conservation. They're all around you. It's really wonderful. We're really proud to host the only SCCS conference in the Americas. There are others around the world. And it's really a perfect fit to our lasting engagement in science education and conservation. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Timon McPhearson. So yes, clap, yes. Dr. McPhearson is a full professor of urban ecology and director of the Urban Systems Lab at the New School. He got his bachelor's degree at Taylor University and his PhD at Rutgers University. And I will mention that a lifetime ago, when he was completing his PhD, Timon also worked here at the museum. He was a biodiversity scientist with us with the CBC and a scientific advisor on ecology for the Museum Science Bulletins. It feels like a long time ago, but we're so glad to have you back. His work aims to illuminate the social, ecological, technical processes that drive urban system dynamics. And in order to just plan in smarter ways, in more equitable ways, resilient ways, and more sustainable cities, right? So note that little social, ecological, technical piece. What it means is that Timon is doing highly interdisciplinary work, and he does this not just through scholarship that draws on multiple kinds of knowledge and inquiry, but also through teaching and community engagement. His research uses both empirical approaches like big data analysis, experiments, and theoretical approaches to help us understand and act on really key issues of how we can be resilient in urban regions, how we can address social vulnerability and climate risk, and also what kinds of directions our policy and management can go and what are their effects. He's also a leader on a global scale, for example, through his role as lead author for key reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So let's all give a big hand to Dr. Timon McPhearson. Welcome.
Good evening. It's great to be here. You stole I was going to say, I used to work here. It was amazing walking up the steps to the museum and just sort of reminiscing about what I used to describe in my younger life in New York as the greatest commute to work one could ever ask for, which is to walk through past the dinosaurs to the little office at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. So it's really great to be back. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Before I tell you about what I do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and where I come from. My father is a Cherokee Indian, and he used to take me to the reservation in North Carolina, the Cherokee Indian Reservation, so he could know where I came from, not just my extended family and helping me see the history of where I come from, but also to understand the values of the ancestors that I have and the deep connection to the land. My father taught me the importance of knowing the names of the plants and animals, of knowing the names of the mountains, and how that connection to the land and to the water develops an ethic for how you live. And he really helped to make me a lifelong environmentalist. This is my great-grandmother, Pansy, and when she was a baby and also when she was older, this was taken on the Indian reservation. I never got the chance to meet her, unfortunately, but I'm deeply grateful to her and to my father for giving to me and my siblings this understanding of where we've come from, what our history is, and most importantly, the kinds of ongoing challenges that indigenous people in this country continue to face every day. That's me and my little sister. I grew up in a tar paper cottage on the farm in East Central Indiana. If you look right up here, you can see a little bit of a pond from this Google Earth image. And the reason I mention it is just to give you a sense of the kinds of experiences that I bring with me. In this case, this was a cottage that had no running water, no plumbing. The small gravel driveway that you can see on the other side of the pond is where my uncle lived, where I went to get water for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. And my mother, one of the things that she taught me is, despite how hard I thought our childhood was, she taught me that there are so many people who have it much worse off. This is the Grant County Courthouse in Marion, Indiana. This is where my parents were married and later divorced. But this is also the site of one of the last public lynchings in America. You may know this story from a famous song that Billie Holiday made famous called Strange Fruit. My mother took me here to bear witness to the legacies of racism that I grew up in and that were surrounding my life and that continue into this day. And she also took me there for when they finally cut that tree down of that site. And I'm telling you these things again because I want you to have a sense of why the focus of my work, my climate work, and my ecological work is really focused on trying to find the points of intervention where we can address the fundamental challenges that continue to plague our societies today, including equity and justice, but also how we can bring those into our efforts to really respond to the climate challenges that we have. So let's talk about climate. As Anna said, last year the IPCC released the first report of 3 reports that are put out, and one of the main things that they showed is that our trajectory in terms of the next 10 to 20 years is pretty locked in. We have a lot that we can do in terms of decreasing our greenhouse gas emissions. All of us need to be part of that solution to bring that down so that we can hold the average global warming to 1.5 degrees or less. But what we also learned, and this really came out strongly in the second report, the Working Group 2 report, which I'll say a little bit more about in a few minutes, is that despite what we do, a certain amount of that change is built into the next 10 to 20 years. So no matter how much we want to focus on the climate problem as a carbon problem or an emissions problem, it's also an adaptation problem. The kinds of extreme events that we're all paying attention to that are happening every week, almost every day around the world that have a climate signal to them is just the evidence of where we're headed in the next 10 to 20 years of the climate change that's already built into our climate system. This is happening at an accelerating rate, and it's happening at the same time as urbanization is changing the way in which we can envision this planet. We've called this, in some cases, the urban century, because it's really the rise of the dominance of cities and really driving all of the major global environmental changes that we see. Urbanization, the rapid expansion of cities, for example, is causing about 1.5 million new people to be added to cities every single week. That's a city the size of Stockholm every week added to the planet. Now just think about what that means, right? That means that all of the resources, all of the infrastructure, all of the services that need to be provided for those people have to be built. It's very carbon intensive right now to do that. So there's a very interesting feedback between the urbanization that's happening at this rapid pace, the consumption and the move to private consumption that is causing a lot of this new resource extraction, how that is driving additional carbon emissions, and then that concentration of people and infrastructure that also creates risk. So there's a really difficult problem that we have to solve, which is how do we break this feedback between cities causing the climate problem and being the locus or the hotspot of where we're seeing some of the worst climate impacts. In the second report, the Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability report, which came out on February 29th, 2 weeks later when I briefed the White House on this to help them understand what were the key findings, I focused on the role of cities and the role of nature as one of the key solutions that we have for addressing the climate challenge. And I'll show you a couple of those key findings here. The first is that climate change is a threat multiplier. Now, what does that mean? Well, for one, it means that cities concentrate, as I mentioned, people, infrastructure, and economies in very small places. So forget about climate change for a second. Cities create their own risk because of the way in which we do that, right? Because our pattern of development, and for many good reasons, we tend to put in very small places lots of people, lots of infrastructure, and it's really the economic engine of the planet, right? 80% of our economy globally comes from cities. But it also means that 70% of our emissions come from cities, 70% of the energy that's used is happening in cities. Now that does mean that cities are there for a reason because they're efficient. They're efficient at providing services, they're more sustainable than many other ways that we could imagine living, but they're also creating risk. Now when you add climate change on top of this, that means now we have what we've described in the report as a threat multiplier. It means that the interaction between the way in which we've developed our cities in a very 20th century model of development, and that's not just here in New York, that's cities all around the world, is interacting with climate change to exacerbate heat, to exacerbate flooding, to exacerbate the way in which storms interact in our cities. Secondly, it's not just the way in which we develop our cities, which is a key thing I think we have an opportunity to change, but it's the location. About 1 billion people by 2050 will be living in cities on the coast. And we know with sea level rise that this is just a challenge that we're already facing and it's only going to get larger. Also, when we think about heat waves and the way in which heat is affecting people and affecting people disproportionately, globally up to 16 times as many people may be exposed to heat waves than we're seeing right now. And this is with middle path scenarios. Thirdly, it's very clear that it's the poor and marginalized who are the most vulnerable to these kinds of climate-driven impacts. This includes climate extremes and storms of all kinds. So if we start to look at where we should expect the kinds of climate impacts. And the point of what I'm going to talk about tonight is how can we target solutions in a way that can have the most effectiveness. Then we're going to need to be thinking about that, not first of all in cities where most people live, and second of all, targeting our solutions for the most vulnerable, those that are most affected because of the inequity of the kinds of risks and impacts that we're already seeing and have clearly documented already. So the real question facing us, I think, is how do we not have this future? The dystopian future that all these statistics and metrics sort of paint, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a depressing story to start off tonight with. And the truth is, it doesn't have to be our future, right? The future's not written. The IPCC doesn't predict anything. It draws patterns and says, this is the pathway that we seem to be on if we continue with the kinds of consumptive behaviors and the kind of practices we have. And I think especially one of the keys for tonight to think about the kinds of development patterns and the way in which we develop the cities that we're building now and that we're not retrofitting in the way that we should yet, but we can. We can shift to these pathways if we start to align many aspects of our society to move along a more positive trajectory. And cities are part of the solution for that. Cities are leaders on climate action already. It's where we see most of the action legally, economically, and otherwise. They're growing extremely fast, as I mentioned. This massive growth in urbanization around the planet is something we can harness as an opportunity. We do not have to build cities the way we have built them in the past. They do not have to be car-centric. They do not have to be heavily paved over. They can be green. They can be ecological. They can really be fundamentally different if we have that vision and we figure out how to get to that better future. And I think nature-based solutions are really one of the most effective adaptation options that we have to both address the mitigation side of the climate problem and the adaptation side, which is, how can we adjust to the climate challenges that are already built in. What I really want to talk about, though, this is sort of the backdrop for it, is how do we build a science of cities that can actually help us understand the complexity of the world that we actually live in. When we walk out of here, and if you just kind of look around with your eyes a little bit more open, see how many aspects of the city you can see simultaneously. People with their different behaviors and perceptions, lots of different languages that are being spoken, the infrastructure, the subways, the buses, the cars, the buildings, the different kinds of buildings. It's a really complex world, and it's interacting with itself and with you dynamically in real time, every minute, every day. It's not that easy to transform this city to be one that's greener, more sustainable, more resilient, one that's more equitable and more just. That's really a tough challenge. It means we have to actually understand the root causes and how they connect so that we can come up with more systemic changes, not simply ones that address a symptom, but address the root causes. And that's what we're trying to do with advancing new forms of data science, new forms of knowledge that take advantage of the kinds of information that now we have at our fingertips that we've never had before in the past. A fundamental conceptual framing for this is to really recognize that the real-time changes that are happening around us all the time are involving the social aspects of our lives and the institutions, the social institutions of our lives, like this one here, the ecological aspects and climatological aspects of our urban systems, and the technological and the infrastructural aspects. They're all affecting each other all of the time. And if we want to really try to understand, for example, how do we reduce risk on the coast from climate change? Or how do we reduce the impacts of the way heat interacts with air pollution in low-income and black and brown communities in New York City in order to have those risks be decreased? Well, we're going to have to address it from a housing perspective. We're going to have to address it from an investment in green space. We're going to have to address it in upgrading the quality of the places where people live and work. All of those things are going to have to come together. And I think this sounds like an impossible challenge, but it's not an impossible challenge. It really requires us to better understand the problems that we've had trouble solving in the past. This is why we launched the Urban Systems Lab, and what we're trying to bring together, and I'll show you some examples of this now, where we take advances in data science, advances in data visualization and design, ways of bringing together multiple types of thinking and knowing. Urban planners, social scientists, economists, ecologists, engineers, designers, sitting around the table together saying, we need to bring this aspect into this problem if we're really going to solve it in a systemic way. and not put Band-Aids on solutions that seem to work for a while and then create new problems in the future. It's a tall order. We don't have all the answers, but we're trying to develop a new science, an urban system science that hasn't really ever existed, that is fundamentally interdisciplinary and requires multiple knowledges and expertise, and not just from the academy, from communities and other knowledge holders as well. This is just to illustrate this, and if you want to get on this later tonight, you can follow this link on your phone. But what I'm trying to explain and show you a little bit of here is the ways in which we're starting to layer model projections of heat risk and flood risk in the city, information about where the elderly live, where the low income live, information about the built infrastructure of the city, and how we can start to build a dynamic analytic environment where we can understand the feedbacks and relationships that are creating problems, also creating solutions that create new patterns, new things emerge. It's a very organic, evolving system, but also old patterns get reinforced, and some of those old patterns are the things that we want to change. So let's focus on one problem for the next 15 minutes or so. Flooding. I don't know how you can not be paying attention to this right now in the news. Hurricane Fiona, Hurricane Ian, this just follows on the Hurricane Ida, which I'll talk about in a minute, from last year and previous. Flooding is a serious challenge. How do we understand how to solve this challenge in the city, and especially for the most vulnerable? One of the things that we started to do in 2018, I co-led a study called the New York City Stormwater Resiliency Study, and the reason this study was launched, the reason the city put a ton of money into trying to understand where flood risk is likely to be a problem is because of Hurricane Harvey. In 2017, when Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston, New York City finally, ever since Hurricane Sandy, kind of woke up to extreme rainfall. We realized we did not have a plan for how to deal with extreme rainfall. We don't even really have an idea of where it's likely to flood. And so we launched a pretty major effort to model where water is likely to pool and stay, how long it's going to stay there, and how fast it's going to move through the city system, so we can understand where to prioritize solutions, because a lot of this ultimately comes down to location-based solutions. Not 100%, but in many cases we need to know where to target the solution so that we can decrease those risks as much as possible. Now, this is not a simple problem to solve, right? How do you know where water is going to go? It requires something we call H&H modeling, hydraulic and hydrologic modeling, coupled dynamic models that require all sorts of data. We need to know where the roads are, where the buildings are, where the green space is. We need to know where the drain pipes are, where the actual physical drains are in the roads. It's not just knowing what's low-lying, like where the low spaces are, right? This has never been possible before because we didn't have that kind of information or that kind of data. Now we can finally start to bring this into an integrated modeling environment, and we can say, as you see here on the right, under a particular rainfall event, and the dark blue spaces are seeing one that was a 3.5-inch rainfall event that was modeled here, where is it likely to flood? And I think one of the things you'll see is that it's everywhere. The blue is all over the city. It's likely to flood in so many places. But that's just a particular rainfall event. Every single rainfall event is different. We have only released 2 scenarios, and part of this is because computationally, this is really difficult, and there's always data challenges. So I'm not going to even get into the real details, but I'm happy to answer questions about how this kind of modeling approach works, but just to say that we're able now to mobilize more and more data, land use data, infrastructure data, buildings and roads data, just as fundamental inputs to try to understand how water moves through an urban landscape like New York City that's highly paved, highly impervious, and basically forces water to pool up and to move fast, which makes it dangerous. We originally planned to develop 20 scenarios. It turned out to be so difficult, so challenging computationally and otherwise, that we ended up with 5, and the city has released 2. And they released 2 because it took us a whole extra year. We planned for 2 years. It took 3 years, and even bringing in additional consultants to really feel like we could trust the outputs from this. But now we have them, and I'm going to show you what we're doing with them. And they were released as part of the New York City Stormwater Resiliency Plan in May 2021. Just a few months later, in September, Hurricane Ida happened, the second largest damaging hurricane in the United States since Hurricane Katrina. Despite spending 3 years thinking and working with all the major city agencies on how do we plan for resiliency. Even putting out a resiliency plan, we were a little blown away by the impacts of Hurricane Ida. You may know a lot about what happened during this, but just suffice it to say that there are many kinds of impacts that we still yet don't have a plan for in terms of how to really build adaptation to this level of flooding. I mentioned that more extreme scenario was a 3.5 inches of rain in 1 hour. Ida dropped 3.1 inches of rain in 1 hour as it was measured in Central Park. So we even came kind of close on trying to figure out what we had to plan for, but it came way before we've been able to enact this, right? I mean, really thinking about putting into place the targets and strategies that were developed in that plan is a 10-year effort at best. But what IDA did is it helped us really laser focus in on the fact that we need to understand not just where the water is, we need to ask fundamental questions about what critical infrastructure is going to be affected. You all know what the subways look like during these events. Who is going to be most impacted and how can we protect them? And those are the questions that we've been focused on, and I'm using this as an example to show how we're starting to mobilize dozens and dozens and dozens of data sets all together in an integrated environment to try to answer some of these simple questions, but we've never been able to really answer them before. Here's an example of some methods. I'm not going to go through them all, but just to say, first we have to understand what we mean by risk and how we're going to measure and assess it. We need to develop the data sets and clean them and make sure they're commensurate with each other. We've got to figure out what is the actual spatial unit that all of these data can talk to each other. How high resolution can we make it? How are we going to do the fundamental analysis that's spatial in this case, really bringing in spatial intelligence and other kinds of methods to reveal patterns and then visualize it in a way to make sense of all that complexity, which is, again, why we need lots of smart people around the table that come from different perspectives as a team. This is team science. Team interdisciplinary science is what's required here. Over 50 variables are all part of this, and by that I mean billions and billions of spatial cells that are all being analyzed together to try to understand, first, where is the flood likely to happen? That's the hydrological modeling part, right? Second, where are the parts of the city where we have more or less population that might be exposed to those areas that are going to be flooded? And third, what are the characteristics of those people or that infrastructure that might make them more or less vulnerable to flooding? All of these have to be understood if we're going to ever get to the answer of where do we focus limited resources to have the most impact to reduce the impacts of flooding in this city. Just to give you a couple examples of those two scenarios, a 2-inch rain event and a 3.5-inch rain event from those modeled outputs from the stormwater resiliency study. Almost 2/3 of New Yorkers have the potential of being exposed in these more extreme scenarios. That's a lot of people to figure out how to protect. Basements really stood out. We knew this was a problem before Hurricane Ida. It was a terrible tragedy, some of the things that happened there, especially in basement apartments in parts of Queens and other places. But if you start to look at what the real range of that problem is, it's pretty large. Up to a few 100,000 basement apartments potentially are in areas that make them likely to flood. So again, coming back to a point I was making earlier, we don't just have to figure out how to get less of the water in and out away from the houses, but we have to increase the quality of housing. We have to be able to help people have higher quality housing, be able to afford to move out of basements, which are, of course, low-lying, which means water's going to flow downhill, and when there's too much of it, it flows extremely fast. Another point I want to make is in the last two bullets here. Black and Hispanic populations are incredibly exposed. They live in areas that are prone to flooding. They have less green space. They have other kinds of inequities and challenges that they're facing every day, and flooding is an additional one. But it's not just about the people. It's about the way in which we rely on transportation and critical infrastructural services during these events and immediately after to pick up your kids from school, or maybe someone has to get to the hospital, or the ability for emergency response units to move. We need to know where all those critical facilities are too, which ones we're going to actually have to build in new places to do that. And that's where this ability to kind of bring all this together in this urban data science approach allows us to start to think about how we prioritize solutions and make them spatially appropriate. Just a few sort of map examples. I'm assuming you're familiar with what city looks like from a satellite view. But this is just some example of some of those nearly 50 variables that I mentioned in terms of the way in which we can start to overlap and look at particular areas that might be more vulnerable from a human perspective, or might be places where we have a higher concentration, dark blue is higher in all of these, a higher concentration of bus routes or subway stops or public safety facilities or healthcare facilities or education facilities. And this is the kind of approach we're trying to take, where we're trying to look at everything that we possibly can, so that when we're thinking about a solution, we're not thinking about it just for protecting schools, which is critically important, or just for protecting the emergency response areas or the low-income housing. But we have to be thinking about all of these together, because there's certain areas that have even higher risk than other parts of the city. If you want to dive into this, feel free to log into stormwater.nyc. Actually, you don't have to log, you just click. And you can zoom around and kind of look at a lot of these layers that we've made publicly available, so you can try to explore and understand some of the risk in your neighborhood as well, including both of those stormwater scenarios that have been released by the city. So what can we do about it? Well, I think one of the fundamental things we can do, it won't solve everything, but it's incredibly powerful, is use nature as our ally, to really think differently about how we design and retrofit and build our cities, including the way in which we can redesign and reimagine New York City, not just new cities that are being developed around the planet, in a way that takes nature as an ally. And it's not just going to help us with flooding. It can help us absorb air pollution, it can help us decrease the effects of heat waves. The IPCC, as I mentioned, made nature-based solutions one of the top 5 solutions for solving the climate crisis, right? Of everything that we can tackle, nature is clearly one of them, because it's multifunctional. It can help absorb carbon, especially in non-urban landscapes, but in the urban landscapes, it's a critical ally in really helping us adapt to the kinds of climate extremes that are coming our way. It's cost-effective, it's often cheaper than gray infrastructure. It tends to get better over time, whereas a lot of our infrastructure solutions tend to degrade over time. Of course, it requires management. We're going to have to be willing to pay for it, but it's very durable, and it offers solutions right away. In a recent report that we released also earlier this year from the World Economic Forum, they developed a new commission on biodiverse cities, and the case we were making in that report was the financial case. They're incredibly cost-effective. There are trillions of dollars to be made, and also there are trillions of dollars to be lost if we don't. The estimates there are about 30 trillion of the global economy is at risk if we don't protect biodiversity and conserve and restore our natural spaces, both within and outside cities, even though this focused the analysis on cities. What I want to know, and what we've been trying to answer, is also, but who's going to benefit from this? Who's benefiting now? In a recent national study that we just released last year, I believe, we looked all across the US at over 5,000 cities and towns. And one of the things we can see, and I know these are small letters, in the light green bars, is that people of color have less green space in their neighborhoods, and they have less access to parks. On the right is income. Low-income populations in the lightest green bars have less green space in their neighborhoods, and they have less access to parks. This is a national scale problem in our cities and towns, and we have to redress this problem. That's, even without climate change, this is a fundamental problem that has to be solved, because the nature in our cities provides health benefits. It provides a whole different way of connecting to nature that, even, as I mentioned, from some of my background, I think helps us really think differently about the world we live in and what we care about. This is critically important to address, and it's also important to address for the disproportionate climate risk that certain people face more than others. We've looked at this a little bit more deeply, and my colleague Pablo Herrero Escantes, who I just want to mention because he's here tonight, has done a lot of the core analysis for this work. In red is something kind of interesting to look at. So that was national. We're back to New York. In New York, one of the things that we see is that if you take a supply-demand approach to this problem, right, where is nature being supplied and where is it needed most? In red are the places where we see the core mismatch of the alignment between these two. The places in the city where we see the most need, and the places in the city where we have the least nature provided for that. So if you think about this from cooling during hot summer days, or from absorbing that stormwater, or from absorbing air pollution, you can see a series of places in the city where we have a lot less of that nature and a lot more need for that nature, because we're using some of those same variables, those income and race and ethnicity variables, to understand where the more vulnerable populations are and where that need is. Now, one thing might stand out to you, which is that Manhattan is always red, and there's a reason for that too, which is because this also depends on population density. If you have a lot of people, you have more need. You can take that out and just look at this from a vulnerability perspective, but my point is that we have a lot of work here to do in New York, but my larger point is we also have new tools at our fingertips to be able to understand these problems. We have new tools to be able to pinpoint where we can focus our solutions to be able to address them, and we can do it in a way that can address multiple problems simultaneously, especially if we're thinking about how we invest in nature. So I'm going to finish up in the last couple slides here and say this all kind of comes back to my overarching goal for this, is to discuss with you the ways in which we can advance a new kind of science, one that's fundamentally integrated across looking at the social dynamics of our city, the ecological structures and functions of the ecology in our city, and the way that interacts with the social dynamics, the technological infrastructure of our city, and how all of these are interacting dynamically to create the patterns that we see, and also gives us a window into how we can shift those patterns if they're not the ones that we want our future to look like. This is not just true for some broad framing of where is the climate risk, it's also true for any solution that we look at. The nature in this city, if we want to invest in green roofs, if we want to plant trees, if we want to create new pocket parks in neighborhoods that have less of them, we have to have management and we have to have local stewardship. We're going to have to be committed to maintaining those spaces. There's a strong need for the social and economic forces to be part of that. Those ecosystems are going to have to be healthy. We need to make sure that they have the biodiversity that they need, and we're going to need the technology to support them. Green roofs don't exist without a roof, and that roof has to be able to hold wet soils, so we're going to have to commit to the financial resources to make this happen. But we can do it, and we can do it if we know a little bit more about how these systems work and how to pinpoint and locate the solutions where they're needed most. Maybe one example of how to think about whether this science is having some impact is to look at the impact we're having here on urban planning and policy. Our work has helped support the Cool Neighborhoods Initiative, a $100 million initiative to reduce heat and heat risk in the city that was launched in 2018. The Stormwater Resiliency Plan, as I mentioned, just came out last year. Just after Hurricane Ida, the city released a new normal report, building on both the conceptual framework that we've done, the modeling work, and this isn't just our team, but our collaborative teams across multiple institutions here in the city, and even trying to help understand and how we frame the state of climate knowledge and where we need to go. I'm very encouraged that on Earth Day this year, the Biden administration announced an executive order on nature-based solutions. 2 weeks after the release of that report, and after the briefing we did with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, they asked me a question. They said, if we want to invest in nature in this country in order to help solve the climate crisis, even if we just focus on the adaptation problem, how much money should we ask for? What should we ask Congress for? What should we go for? And I had to say, I have no idea. We don't know. We don't know what level of investment we need in nature in order to meet the challenge of the climate problem. We don't even really know how much benefit we're already getting. So I was really excited that on the 22nd of April, the administration announced the first ever national nature assessment. Another part of the strategy they announced, which most people, this will go off your radar and you'll forget about it, but it's really important, is the National Accounts Initiative, which is basically saying that we're going to have to value nature in our economic performance across all federal agencies. That is a huge game changer. And lastly, that they're going to identify priorities for nature-based solutions moving forward, and I'm expecting some good announcements on this in November at COP27 from the administration, so hopefully we can hold them to it. So I'll just finish and say that we know that we have to radically change the way in which we develop our cities. We know that we have to do that at a societal scale, at a planetary scale. We're not going to be able to do that unless we can align the many dimensions of our complex societies together and get them pulling in the right direction. And I think some of the advances we're able to make in the core knowledge production through an urban system science is a starting point for that. And I'll stop there and say thanks. I appreciate talking to you. That's my thank you.
All right. So does anyone have any questions for Dr. McPhearson? Please just raise your hand and the mic will come to you. Ellie.
Hello? Hi, over here on by the entrance side. Hi.
Hey.
So I had a question about, so you kind of said that, we need to invest more in infrastructure, we need to have better buildings that have, green space and so on and so forth, get people out of basements, all that. All of that also kind of is another way of saying that is gentrification. So how do we make sure that people can still afford to live in those areas after we improve them instead of turning them to ghost towns?
It's an excellent question. I'm glad you brought it up. It's essential for us to address it. And I think this is tough to address because we have to think about how we develop these kinds of solutions in a way that cuts across the city agencies and across the way in which we make particular kinds of development decisions, right? So we absolutely, in my opinion, we need to invest in nature. And I think if we really took this on at the scale of the way, of the problem that we have and the solution potential that we have, we would invest massively all across the city. And it wouldn't be in small places where we can see this rapid gentrification. On the other hand, if we don't do that at the same time as we put in rent controls and subsidies and incentives for people to be able to stay in their homes as their neighborhoods are changing, then I think we will have that problem, and we're already seeing that in some cases. So the way to solve what some have framed as the problem of potential green gentrification, which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't, is that we can't just invest in the parks. We have to invest in social and public housing. We have to invest in rent subsidies. We have to couple the strategies from housing and preservation developed from our HPD office, and we have to couple that with the strategies from the Parks Department and with the Department of Environmental Protection. I think one of the things the city is doing really well on this is that after Hurricane Sandy, we set up an office that was called the Mayor's Office of Resilience. Now it's the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, but it has power to work across agencies. Most cities don't have that. That doesn't mean they've figured out how to solve all of this, but at least we have some of the governance structure to start to address that problem. But again, I think the fundamental thing is that we have to couple solutions, and that's why I've been talking about coupled problems. And we're not going to get there unless we couple solutions together. One solution at a time tends to just cause side effects because of the tight connectedness of the systems we live in.
When you build out the infrastructure and you're talking about nature in general, are you planting for the future climate, or are you going to be planting species that can exist today but maybe not in the future? Can you go over that decision making? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. That's already happening here in New York, and I think we're seeing more and more of that in cities all around the world where they're starting to recognize that we have to be planting for the species of tomorrow. So this might mean, for example, sourcing from nurseries in North Carolina and Virginia in terms of plant species or tree species that are already adapted to a warmer and wetter climate and bring those into New York. This is well known within the Parks Department here in New York City. It's one of the things that we see expanding really rapidly in biodiversity agendas in cities all around the world, the recognition that the biodiversity is going to have to shift to adapted species to the new climate normal that's likely to be here in 10, 20, or even 50 to 100 years from now. Of course, that means paying attention to how species are already moving, really getting a handle on all of that information, and picking your climate scenario, because it depends a little bit on whether you're an optimist or a realist or a bit of a pessimist in terms of which scenarios that you look at. But that's essential, I think, because we want to make sure that whatever we're investing in will last, and that means it's going to have to be adapted to the new normal.
Back to your right.
Hi, thanks so much. This was so informative. I'm coming to the climate resilience, climate change conversation from a very different perspective. I work in international development, so I work on youth workforce development programs, and where we've been coming to it from in the last 4 or 5 years, and this is primarily in Africa and Asia, in my organization, is working with youth to raise awareness on what kinds of jobs they might be able to create and what kind of jobs they might be able to engage in. And depending on the context, some youth are very aware, right? We know the youth are very interested in supporting climate resilience. So I'd like to hear from you a little bit about how you're engaging with young people and where maybe there are job opportunities or capacity building opportunities for young people as well.
Great, thank you for that. You know, I'm amazed by the not just the youth involvement, but the pace of change in a lot of African cities that are really investing in nature-based solutions, it's amazing how fast they can do things. It's just a really different context. I work with a few different groups that are really heavily involved in this, especially in the sub-Saharan regions within Africa. And I think it's a model for some of the things that we want to take to other regions in the world. The youth involvement is a key part of that, but I think it's also just doing it. We're not waiting for policy change. Yes, we need to get money and investments, but in a lot of cases, they're mobilizing and just getting things done, and I think it's really impressive. Workforce development, though, in general, is becoming an increasing buzzword in how finances are being, I was going to say agreed, but moved, right? So being able to argue that you can create jobs and that you can create new opportunities as part of these investments is a way of, at least in this country, getting more federal support, and we're seeing that being coupled with grants, whether the community level grants or otherwise. So I think that's a really key part of it, but we're not there yet, right? This is a key issue that I think relates back to the gentrification. I've been talking too fast and too long. The gentrification question, which is, if you're going to invest in a particular neighborhood, whether it's through nature-based solutions or otherwise, we need to make sure that the jobs that are created in there are benefiting the community that's being changed, right? To build income and financial security into that. And I think youth is one of the avenues for that, but just in general, workforce development, where we're building these infrastructure projects, is a key part of coupling together concerns about finance security and concerns about climate security and other things in the same kind of approach.
Thank you very much for that. So my question really deals with places in the country or even the city. Are there places where we shouldn't permit people to live because they're simply too low-lying, because we know the course of nature? I'm thinking of places like Houston, New Orleans, or even places, areas of New York City.
It's a question a lot of people are asking. The question behind the question is, who gets to decide? And I don't get to decide. And anybody who might live in those places will tell you that you don't get to decide for them what their future is, right? The attachment to place is a deep part of people's identity. It's a deep part of the culture that we come from and how we identify as people on this planet. And so it is not easy to uproot communities. Now, we've tried that here in New York after Hurricane Sandy. We created buyback programs for people to get paid to leave their houses, to work in this area of trying to slowly move communities away from the coast. Some of the communities took that as an opportunity to get out of harm's way, and others put in their roots and said, no, this is my home, I've been here for generations, and this is where I want to stay. And we see this all across places that are at risk of various kinds of climate impacts. So it's not an easy answer. It is a question we're going to have to keep grappling with. Here in New York City, the city is thinking really seriously about what that could look like. What is a process for working with communities to start the conversation, to over a, probably a 10 to 20 year period of really trying to understand, do they want to move? If they want to move, how would they move? What would move look like? Where would you move to? How could you retain your connections to place if you're doing that? I think we're going to have that conversation, so I'm glad you brought it up as a question, because we all have to be thinking about places that are going to get more risky. But it's not an easy solution, and who has a say in that is really what matters. Right? And the communities that are involved have to not just be at the table, but need to be driving the conversation.
Dr. McPhearson, here in New York City, I believe it was the City Council that passed new legislation in 2021 banning the use of natural gas appliances going forward. It's going to take effect, scheduled to take effect in 2 or 3 years in new construction. All existing structures are in essence grandfathered, and they could continue to have their gas stoves. I think everyone understands that the environmental dangers of natural gas, and it is a fossil fuel. At the same time, Reason Magazine did a really interesting piece shortly after this in December, that they did a cost-benefit analysis of what it would involve transferring from banning natural gas to electricity, the increased demand on electricity, and they concluded with a lot of figures that the goal would not be achieved, that in essence, that the amount of greenhouse gases that would come from the unexpected, unintended consequences do not warrant this. And a second question, very much related to this, at what point will someone figure out a way, will there be technology for electricity to produce flames for cooking?
You really like the flames when you're cooking, don't you?
Every cook does.
I know, I like it too. I fancy myself as a cook. But I won't make dinner tonight, I'll be home too late. But I did last night. So we can talk about that, but I think it's part of a larger set of issues, which is how do you transition us to a renewable energy-driven economy when it's going to cost us? It's going to cost us in carbon, because we can't radically shift all of our modes of production to be carbon-free or carbon zero as we're trying to create new carbon zero or carbon neutral products, right? It's going to be expensive from a carbon perspective, and it might even be expensive from an economic perspective. But I don't think we have any choice in the transition of moving away from fossil fuels. So these kinds of legislations, and I think the Climate Mobilization Act that was passed here in New York City has done some really good starts to things, requiring green roofs and solar roofs on all new buildings that are going to be constructed, starting to think about things like, you might like your gas stove for cooking, but it's unhealthy indoors for you, and it's unhealthy for the environment, so we can do a lot better. And my induction stove, which I've had for 12 years, I have to say, is just as responsive as gas, heats up 5 times faster, and you can boil water so fast you cannot believe it. So making pasta for the kids is like that. We can all adapt to that, right? Now, is it going to cost us some because the production of a new oven is going to cost? Yes. We're going to have to suffer through that, and so is the environment, in order to get to the lower carbon emissions that we really need to be achieving. And transitions are tough, whether you're moving out of a place because it's too risky to live there, or whether it's the economic cost of investing in new technology. Transitions are tough. We're going through a transition period. We need to move through it with some urgency, I think, and we need to move through it with some commitment, and we're going to have to know that it's not all going to be easy, and there's going to be some trade-offs.
Yes. Are there any cities in the U.S. that are ahead of the curve that you would think are ahead of the curve with their urban system science? What are those cities, and where does New York rank?
New York is very high. Phoenix is doing a lot of really amazing work. There's really new cool work happening in Atlanta, for example, that are bringing together similar kinds of information and challenges and framing and problems. I think New York is a front runner, frankly, but there's reasons for this. One, cities in general are where the intellectual powerhouses are, right? They're where most of the universities are. New York City is the largest city in America. It has some of the, most access to intellectual resources in general, let alone computers and computation and other things. It's data rich. New York City was one of the first cities to really start making data publicly available. Some of that information I showed you about, and I flashed it really fast, about, for example, variation in income across the city, or variation in age. I used to pay for that data. In 2012, and 2011, 2010, I bought it from the city. Every quarter, I had to pay $2,000, and I had to raise grants to afford to buy it so we could do these kinds of analyses. Then New York City made that open. Other cities are following suit to start to make this data open and publicly available. That's an essential ingredient to doing any of this work. If you can't get access to the data, you can't do data science, right? So I think New York City is very far ahead of the curve on that. It's really been a model for other cities that have copied it, and it's been allowing us to do a lot of really interesting work here that, again, creates opportunity for other cities to follow suit. I'm kind of a New York fan, though, so I don't know. Yeah. Oh, I can't point.
So one question over here. I'm in the back right here. Keep turning. There you go. Gotcha. What is one thing besides voting that we can all do differently to support your cause, our cause?
It's our cause.
Yep.
There are over 2,000 stewardship organizations in this city alone. Over 2,000. It's crazy how much people are involved in doing things and creating change. Get involved with one. Volunteer some time and get involved with one. And what I always tell my students is, pick something to work on. Don't make it too hard, right? Whether it's working in the community garden, volunteering in the soup kitchen, any number of things that you can be doing. And if you find out that it's easy for you, add something. Add one more thing. We all need each other to solve some of these problems. Creating community and working in your local communities is one of the best ways to do it. But again, there are so many amazing organizations, and if you can't find the one that works for you, start a new one, because there's really no shortage of challenges for us to be working on. So I would say, just in short, that work with your local community organizations, invest in your neighborhoods. Every single neighborhood has need, some more than others, and if you really want to target it, see where those neighborhoods are and see what you can do. Go in humbly. If this is not your place, or if you're a newcomer, there are people who have lived there for a really long time. They have their own sense of what that neighborhood needs, so start by listening.
I was wondering if you could talk about the role that Indigenous stewardship plays in your work as well?
What kind of stewardship?
Indigenous stewardship.
Well, Indigenous stewardship in my work doesn't play a large role, because I don't work very closely with Indigenous communities myself. I think this is a problem to identify, in the sense that in the work that I'm doing, or the work that my colleagues are doing, or any similar work that we're doing across the city, has a lot to learn, not only from Indigenous knowledge and perspectives, but even in ways of thinking through problems, right? Even in problem identification, or even if that's the right way to frame it or not. And I don't know the answers to that, because we still need to ask some of those questions. So I think it's really important for us to be, again, constantly broadening in terms of the diverse types of knowledges and perspectives that need to be part of really designing and framing a future that can benefit everyone, that's more inclusive.
All right, everyone, that's all the time we have for tonight. Please join me in thanking the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, Anna Prozakanski, and of course, Dr. Timon McPhearson. Thank you very much. We will see you next time. SciCafe is back in person the first Wednesday of every month. So the next time will be November 2nd. Until then, have a lovely evening.